Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm super excited to have everyone here and welcome everybody back, probably for 2023, more importantly, for our Empire Masterclass series. It is our first show of 2023. Now, if you're joining us for the first time, my name is Paul Jantz, and we are here thanks to Professional Partners Education and our fantastic supporters back for 2023. Again, Paul Chadwick, Profit Master, iKeep, and Lloyd's Auctioneer. So thanks to all of our sponsors. They are wonderful. It's great to have you back again. Now, while we've got a massive show today, and all of you are joining us live through Zoom, we've got a huge lineup of guests scheduled for the next 6 months. So please stay with us. It's going to be fantastic. Every month, we're going to bring you new guests, new thoughts, new ideas, new ways that you can look at your own business, your own leadership or management within the business, and little tweaks that hopefully our guests can provide you with to how you can go about making some positive changes to the business. We're going to focus on all sorts of things today, so I look forward to sharing that with you. Now, for those of you joining us for the first time as well, not too sure about Professional Partners Education, we're a content platform. So we're a content platform built for our accounting community. That's probably the best way to put it, where we're providing all sorts of educational learning. It's free educational learning. So to all of you that are in a part of our Professional Partners community, it's all for you, for your team members. Our 2022, we started this 12 months ago, so it's great to be back for 2023, as I mentioned before. And all of our content that we've done in the past, if you've missed anything, it is all on our YouTube channel. Jump into YouTube and type in Professional Partners Education, and our PPE Plus station will pop up with all the content you've got. And there's also a bit of technical content there as well with our Lunch and Learn series we've been running since July last year. So it's all there for you guys, free of charge. Now, today's doesn't get any bigger than, when we're talking about some great names in Australia, the De Bortoli family comes up. There's no doubt about it. And I think that's the great thing about what we're going to be able to do today. We're going to tap into some the mind of the managing director, Darren De Bortoli, and he's going to share some really, really fantastic things about, obviously, their business has been operating for 95 years. There's some, great secrets within that, and I'm looking forward to tapping into those. Darren, how are you?
Good, thanks, Paul.
Brilliant, mate. So, mate, where are you coming from today? It looks like a beautiful little view there.
Yeah, based in Bilbal, which is the site of our main winery in the Riverina, so just outside of Griffith.
Beautiful. It's a good spot. Nice and warm there.
Yeah, it's fairly warm today, so it's been good because it has been very cool growing season. So grapes are way behind where they normally are. Nearly 3 weeks behind normal. Okay, so there's some of the, I suppose, offline we were talking about some of the problems and solutions which we're going to be sharing. There's something that sometimes out of your control. You can't control that, can you? No, it's and each vintage is different. It's amazing. You get thrown curveballs all the time. And, I was just talking to the winemakers the other day about how in the hell did we get through, the 2011 season when it rained from beginning of the vintage to the end of it. And that was Cyclone Yasi, if everyone remembers. And it's just a horrible wet vintage. And then in 2012, the vintage was fantastic and looked like being an absolutely great vintage. And we'd finished the whites and just started, only got about a third the way through the reds, and we were hit with over 300 millimeters of rain in a week, which basically wiped out the remainder of the red crop. So two very bad vintages in a row caused a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I can imagine. You can only, and they're the things that if we've got time, we might delve into a little bit of that, how you actually, what's your risk mitigation plan for things like that come into play that can obviously devastate a whole crop, but maybe 2 years, that puts you way behind. So if we've got time, we'll come back to that, which would be fantastic. Now, if you're joining us, it'd be rude not to have a glass of red. So I've got mine here.
I've got coffee
as well. I know, to all the firms that joined us last night as well. We had a whole Chadwick function last night in Melbourne, and I know there's a number of firms joining us. So yeah, had a couple of those as well last night. So topping up at 12 o'clock will be interesting. Mate, let's maybe start with the history of the family. The De Bortoli family, again, it's quite an amazing little story. Family run, family owned, 95 years young. I'm sure you're very proud of that. Tell us a little bit about that. You okay to start with the history?
Yeah, I am. First, probably correct his pronunciation. It's De Bortoli. So, but I don't. A lot of people would call it De Bortoli. Well, I don't care as long as they buy my product. But if someone wants to win a bet, the bet about pronunciation of the name's always a good one. So anyone listening, it's De Bortoli, not De Bortoli.
Very good.
But it goes back to the start. My grandfather all my grandparents literally came from the foothills of Mount Grappa. And Mount Grappa was the front line during the First World War. So you had the beginning, they were in the foothills and then the beginning of the mountain ranges. And from where they lived, they could see Mount Grappa in the distance. And the area was, as a result, was devastated by the First World War. And there's a massive cemetery at Mount Grappa. And so my grandfather was the youngest. Victoria De Bortoli was the youngest of 8 kids. And he always says the reason why he left was because he didn't like being treated like a peasant. Now, I think that was more to do with the fact that he was the youngest of a family of 8. You can imagine, so been bullied and whatever. So he wanted out. He came to Australia. And the interesting thing about 1924 was the year that the US banned immigration from Italy because the Italians had exceeded their 2% threshold. So they said, no more Italians. And so I laugh about the thought I could easily be American, but I'm glad he came to Australia instead. And I suspect one of the reasons that we would have come to Australia anyhow, because he wanted to get as far away from the rest of his family as possible. So he came out in 1924, scrimped and saved, and 1928 he was able to acquire a mixed farm. 1928 was leading up to the Great Depression years. He couldn't sell the grapes that he was growing, so he decided to make wine himself. And back in those days, 90% of wine sold was fortified wine, and a lot of it was being exported to the British market. And so he made table wine, which is a lot of the newly arrived Italian, European immigrants loved wine. So he had a ready market for table wine. So more of the sort of beverage quality table wines that were dominated by fortified wines at that stage. And that really didn't change until 1972 when table wine exceeded fortified sales for the very first time. So that's a relatively recent sort of change in terms of the culture history of the company. You could call that the cappuccino effect. So he started making wine, and sort of ups and downs in that process. The role of my grandmother, Giuseppina, was exceptionally important because she was literally the brains of the outfit. My grandmother, Victoria, was the grunt and she was the brains, and she was able to read and write in Italian, French, and in English. So, the story goes, she taught the local headmaster of the local primary school French, and he taught her English. So it went back for a very early start. The family has slightly expanded. Then my father, Dean De Bortoli, came onto the scene, and he was a typical young entrepreneur, was wanted to expand the business, very much to my grandfather's disgust. And so the story goes, when my grandfather would go to the Sydney warehouse, which was located in Annandale at that time, when it was more of a sort of industrial sort of precinct, and my father would then turn around and spend lots of money back at the winery, building up the winery, and lots of arguments between my father and my grandfather, which I find are sort of rather hilarious. I studied winemaking in Roseworth in South Australia in the late 70s. And I joined the company, and my claim to fame was the development of a very famous sweet wine called Nova One, using a fungus called Botrytis cinerea, which at that stage, the wine industry could not comprehend that you could make great sweet wines in Australia, because the argument was it's too hot and dry, and and it was not suitable. And as it turns out, botrytis is far more prevalent than people realised. And with in 82, that was the beginning of our very first wine. In those days, we called it Sauternes, because that was part of the geographical. There's no agreement with the European Union. We're using terms like port and champagne. And then when we did signed the agreement with the EU to get rid of use of geographic indicators, to allow us to trade into the European market, and which the industry agreed to, and it opened the doorway. And where Australia was lucky is, now we call things like, by then, the varietal name. White Burgundy was Chardonnay, so we called it Chardonnay, and that's quite simple for the consumers. So simplifying meant that we had was actually in some ways a game winner for us. And from those days, the industry expanded, and we were very much in part of that whole expansion process, undergoing problems with China to the current state of the industry at the moment, which is not very good. It's between COVID-related supply issues, which basically saw the cost of containers go to the roof, China applying punitive duties on Australian wine up to 200%, just destroyed any wine sales into China. And at the moment, there's obviously toing and froing whether they will remove those punitive duties.
Did you as a part of your transition and growth into places like China, was that a high percentage of your sales?
No, and I suppose it was a very lucrative, but a small part of our sales. And for us, China wasn't the dominant, was never one of the dominant markets. It was one of many markets that we sold into. So it was the diverse customer base that we had that has allowed us to withstand the current turmoil going through the industry.
Yeah, I can imagine, because you can imagine where if it was a high, that would obviously decimate the business even more. So
well, exactly, and certainly having large impacts in South Australia, which became very reliant on the China trade.
Yeah, I suppose it's like any sort of business that has that. If you're relying on one customer or customer segmentation, which is a high percentage, and then something happens to that industry, that obviously can devastate the business.
Well, exactly. And certainly part of the problems in the wine industry, and we have a market that's dominated by two very big players in the liquor distribution, and that's the Woolworths Endeavour Group and Coles. So that's trying to diversify as many markets as possible is in the current circumstances has been exceptionally important.
Now, you mentioned before, it was interesting where your father and your grandfather was it sort of, call it a little bit of loggerheads and going in different directions. Have you experienced anything like that with when you've come on board and your other family members, and even let's call it the next generation coming through? How would you deal with that in today's world when you've got certain, you think I want to go in that direction and the tradition is over in this direction? How would you combat that?
Yeah, no, in the early days, I had massive arguments with my father, part of the tradition, and which was laughable because it was just history repeating itself. But now, when my father passed away back in 2003, so my mother's very much been the matriarch of the family, and for her, it's all about family. So, and one of the things that she said about the business is, I don't know much about the business, but I know people, which is a very important observation.
Yeah, brilliant. We're going to get to the matriarch art soon, actually, because I want to tap into that as well. So let's talk about philosophy for running a successful business. There's no doubt, 95 years, I don't know how many businesses would last 95 years, but the way it's been run, obviously the respect, you use the word then family, whether that's family as in blood, or whether there's a lot of other companies that see their team members or their management as a part of the family as well. What's your philosophy for running a successful business?
Well, being family controlled and family owned, the board is all family members, and we did sort of play around with having an external chairman, but the caused friction. So I think where everyone's basically on the same page, it's fine. The management group has a very important role, of which the family members are a part of it, but they're not a dominant part of the management group of the organisation. Where all the senior managers, we get around and discuss issues every Wednesday morning, and most of the family members are part of that as well. So we deal with all the issues on a weekly basis, talk about problems going forward.
Yep. So what does success continue to look like for you?
Oh, in the current environment, survival. Because it's not very pretty out there for the wine industry, I always say that when we're hurting, I know the rest of the industry is on its knees, and it currently is a very tough environment. So hopefully China will lift their foot off our necks, and the supply chain issues with high cost of containers resolves itself.
Yeah, we were actually having a chat about that only last night with a couple of people sharing, call it containers, and they were talking about how cars are just in limbo at the moment because of a certain bug that the government doesn't want to let into the country, which obviously can have a devastating effect for farmers and obviously our grapes and all sorts of things. So there's a lot of knock-on effect on that side of it as well, isn't there?
Yeah, and a lot of the concerns are tend to be dismissed because they're seen as anti-competitive, behaviour by farmers and that. But it goes back to what they call the white spot disease in prawns, and that was clearly identified as a major concern by allowing uncooked seafood into Australia. It took hold in Australia and it devastated a lot of prawn farms and whatever. So the very tight protocols Australia have in place for controlling diseases and that, and which can have a devastating effect. It just shows you it's not anti-competitive. It's genuine concerns. And I remember Bill Heffernan was one of the few leading the charge against the white spot disease and expressing concerns. And they went ahead and a few years later, he was proven right. It devastated the prawn industry.
Yeah, and they're the things, I suppose, that we need to continually keep an eye out for, and again try and mitigate as much as possible.
Well, it's all part of that risk mitigation, isn't it? Yeah. Really, government policy and that, which is something I face all the time. Taxation of wine, but also involved very much in the politics of the Murray-Darling Basin, the water politics, and I'm being a great critic of the current plan because it lacks flexibility, it lacks pragmatism, it lacks common sense, and that all ties in part of that, or part of that minimisation of risks, I suppose. Because certainly when Darren De Bortoli came out, and my father was very much a legacy, was water security was very high on their list, and it's one of the reasons he came to the Riverina in the early days, because Burrinjuck had just finished being built dam, and that was 1913 when water started flowing into the Murrumbidgee irrigation area, and the old timers were sensible because they built the region was built off the floodplain, so they directed the water off further upstream, which came around and ended, which meant that we were off the floodplain. So that's pragmatism of that. Our forefathers. I'm very critical of people condemn them for making mistakes. As Malcolm Turnbull said, he's fixing up a problem. The only problem was that Malcolm Turnbull had no idea what he was talking about when he was talking about the Murray-Darling Basin. Because nearly all the problems in I think there was a guide that came out, 7:30 report last night, showed the plan was being, the guide to the plan was being burnt, and very upset farmers in Griffith. And, well, I say every single claim, and I mean every single claim, from species decline, which was due to invasive species, salinity, which is well managed, and turbidity in the water system, which was due to invasive species like carp, creating problems, destroying aquatic plants in the river system. Every single claim was wrong. The salt was being well managed before, and that was because the issues were identified back in the 90s, and they did a sensational job mitigating salt. And it's just one of those, and it's all part of it. When you start looking at risk mitigation, it's quite an extensive list when you start talking about agriculture.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's obviously something that you guys as a management team, you spoke about the board and your actual management team, which we'll chat about in a second as well. But that's something you're constantly looking at. And do you see that as a major part of how successful the business will be in the future, to mitigate as much as that?
Yeah, we're very much part of it. So you got a lot of people have different views, and we discuss it every Wednesday morning. We get together and we go from them. All my direct reports. We sit around and we go through. Everyone gives their view of the world and the reports and what's happening, and so the communication flow is pretty important. And communication's probably number one. And I've been a big fan of open office setups, which is really a trade-off, because open offices mean, yes, communication's good, but yep, you have those privacy issues where Joe Blogg's talking next to you and whatever. But there was a classic example just highlighted recently when one of the staff was talking about an issue with caps, and one of the other staff members looks at in the purchasing department, overheard the conversation, and said, "Look, now we've got caps. Just they've been written off, so they're there. Rather than they turn around and reorder caps, which we already had because it became obsolete for the project they were being used, but they were still they're still available. It's just they weren't in the system because they'd been written off. It's crazy things like that. It was a classic example of an open office design.
Yes. So you mentioned every Wednesday. Are you okay sharing with everyone? Because this is a great thing, I suppose. Been in the accounting industry for as long as I have, and funny enough, I caught up with a good friend yesterday for lunch, he's actually a guest on my next show, and I'll share that at the end of today. But we caught up for lunch, and we worked together 25 years ago in the accounting industry where we started. And obviously, there's always been this element of whether it be open office, whether it be how well we communicate. How regularly do we run our meetings? How's the reporting, and who speaks and who reports in those meetings? You okay to give us a quick overview of what those Wednesday mornings look like?
Yeah, no, fine. It's just it's a get together, and all my reports, marketing manager, national sales manager, the operations manager, the export manager, who happens to be my brother, and then my other brother looks after the farming operations in the Griffith region, our HR manager, our chief accountant or financial controller, and our IT manager. So they're all my direct reports, and we all throw around different, everything's thrown around. So trying to get everyone on the same wavelength is a very important part of management. So I think, that's where these meetings are important. This old story about silos, is a real issue that most businesses face, I suppose. And probably, depends on your focus. When I took over running the company back in '94, at the time, I sort of came from the operations. It was very much, the only thing I knew was the command and control structure. And one of the best things that ever happened to me, a friend of mine worked in HR department for another company, and she sent me a book to read. And that was a book called Maverick by Ricardo Semler. And it's probably one of the most important books I've ever written, because even though I'd sort of disagree with some of the fundamental, things that we're doing, but it opened up my eyes in terms of the importance of empowering and trusting staff. And that was the key takeaway from that book. And that completely resulted in getting away from this command and control structure, because no one's that smart in an organization unless you work for Enron.
And so you've got, let's say, you reeled off probably, let's say, 10 direct reports there. Do you give them 2 or 3 key points that they must report on every single Wednesday?
No, it's probably not, but that's probably not a bad idea, because one of the things that we don't cover on, we tend to deal with the short-term, the medium-term issues rather than the long-term issues. But I think because of the osmosis process, most of the long-term issues are probably well recognised within the management group anyhow.
Yep.
But yeah, probably having a structure in terms of 3 talking points maybe is good, because some of the presentations and talks can drag on for a bit of, can drag on. But I think it's important that everyone says their piece and everyone's fully informed what every department's doing. And
how long would those meetings typically go for?
Oh, it can range from an hour to 2 hours, depending on the topic. Yeah. So if it's a fairly contentious topic, it can really drag on.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's also the beauty. Sorry, interrupt. That's also the beauty of other people within the other divisions hearing as well. Just getting let's call it a holistic approach to what are we working with as a management group and the sort of problems that we're working with.
Well, it is, because you've got to remember everyone's got a different focus. So if you're sales, you really couldn't give a stuff about the problems that manufacturing winemakers putting forward, and then if you're in marketing, you're not going to be completely aligned with what the national sales may be. And then you've got the IT, and they've got limited resources, so they've got to prioritise the limited resources they've got in terms of making sure they're applied effectively and efficiently, and then at the end of the day, being able to pay the bills is pretty important. Yeah. So we're actually one of the few wine companies that actually pay for all our grapes 30 days after receipt. We're the only ones in the wine industry that do that. So as soon as the grapes are in, and at the end of the following month period, the grapes are paid for. And now most wine companies will pay for grapes over several months. Mm. And we made that as a decision because it certainly helped with our growers' cash flows, but it also gave us a bit of an advantage in terms of reputation of that with our growers, which can get rather testy, because, for example, the current environment's a good example. The very low prices being paid for reds, and the growers get pretty upset because they've been used to higher prices. But that was a manifestation of the manifestation of the China ban, which was predominantly red markets. And I knew where it was going. When you're in the industry so long, you know how things will eventually play out. So we had to make that break this year, and just the hard realities of the current market conditions the growers had to be aware of it. And we actually discourage our growers to be growing reds this year for 2 reasons. And we said to them the prices were going to be low, and the disease pressures from having a wet season, a very wet season, were going to be very high. And we certainly nailed that one very big time, because the flooding and everything else that's happened. The company has a number of operations, a number of vineyards. So our major winery and vineyards are in the Riverina, but our biggest vineyard resources are actually in Victoria. So we have a large vineyard in King Valley, a large vineyard in Rutherglen, a large wine vineyard in the Heathcote region, Victoria, and other the Yarra Valley operation, which is the diamond, as far as the company's concerned, is also. So it was just interesting to see all our different operations were impacted one way or another with the floods. One of the vineyard were flooded out, and we're fortunate the flood water only lasted a few days, and it was out, and then they just had to clean up. They had a big mess to clean up, and that happened in the King Valley. But and when the vineyard was set up basically to follow the flow of water, so it flowed through the vineyard rather than against the vineyard. Yes. And then with the disease pressures, where most of our vineyard managers were able to get the sprays on in time down here, that there was a mistake made was in the Heathcote region. So our yields in Heathcote have been decimated. But generally, the yields in the wine stream have been badly impacted because of disease pressures this year. So that's the light at the end of the tunnel, is the fact that this vintage will be a very low vintage. And because it's so cool and crops have been reduced, it could be a very good quality vintage as well in the warm areas. Cool areas may struggle because of the cooler conditions.
Yeah. Like you spoke about Ricardo Semler before with the book Maverick, and again, to anyone listening, and if you haven't read it, it's a really good book. I think I read it about 20 years ago as well. The way that you were taught, let's say, when you got handed the reins, and obviously you've got another generation coming through now with the teaching and the learning element. What's your philosophy again to teaching and or learning?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose, the old command and control structure, which was, the legacy of my father, which was, that comes from a bygone era. And like I said, it's just lucky that 30 years ago I was given this book, and because you're suddenly thrust in the role of managing director for a not an insignificant family business, and you're not really being prepared for it. And like I said, if I tried on command and control structure, was not only would have burnt me out, and it's just the current environment is just, things are just far too complex. So that's where that book was just absolutely awesome in terms of readjusting how I thought about things, and starting to empower my staff. I still have arguments with them about certain things, because and a lot of those arguments are about a viewpoint. So whether it's short term, medium term, or long term, which another thing people forget about, it's the time frame that you're referring to. Will give you different answers.
True. True. And I think that's the great challenge that we all have, I suppose, whether it's whether you're a winemaker as an example, or like our audience, they're a group of accounting firms. So they've got the technical aspects of, let's say, or the analytical aspects of, let's say, accounting or winemaking, but we're not taught leadership. We're not taught how to manage when we take on those roles. We take on certain roles within a business, and then we need to adapt to people's personalities, as a classic example. So how do you manage that, and how do you work through that? And I think that's the great thing about whether it's like it's books. I know I got recommended 2 books. This is the great thing about Amazon nowadays. I was at dinner last Friday night in Brisbane. I got recommended a book, and funnily enough, it was The Wolf of Wall Street, his book. And I ordered it that night. I'm a person that takes action straight away. So bang, you get out the phone, you jump on Amazon, order it straight away. I flew home the next morning, and the book arrived before I did.
Amazing. Yeah.
Amazing. And I must admit, I've been really enjoying that. And the other one I'm reading at the moment is called 10X by Grant Cardone. So again, how to 10X your business. So things like that. And that's what these little masterclasses are all about, I suppose, is that sharing of information to add to someone's already management or leadership structure.
Yeah, well, culture is a very big part of it too. And people don't understand how important culture is. And when you see that all the time, where one company might take over another company, the cultures may be very diverse, and the issues that creates. And I know in the early days, some of the early consolidation, that 10 years later, they still had to mesh the cultures of an organization. Then that just, and we saw that just recently when we acquired an acquisition in Europe of all times, but that's another story, was the culture of the 2 businesses trying to, were very different, and, trying to make sure that the cultures are aligned in the first place is a very important consideration. And that's a consideration when we looked over, when we purchased our Rutherglen facility off the Chinese, interesting enough, about 4 years ago. And one of the things we certainly looked at was fully recognizing how that group would fit in with our group. And it was fairly seamless in some ways. but there were other issues. It's amazing as the main director, you say something in jest, and people can take it literally, and you just cringe when that happens. You know, you're just saying something as a throwaway line and just not meaning for it to be taken seriously, and it's taken seriously, and that causes all sorts of uproar in the organisation. It's just fascinating how that happens.
Absolutely, and it can happen in an instant as well.
Well, exactly. So, you know, it's certainly something to be mindful. But you know, in the early days, and I suppose it comes back to all organisations. I had this argument with my son, who's currently working for Grant Thornton, but you know, he was talking about who's one of the most important people in an organisation, and he was, I think he might have been Jack Welsh, is it, from the CEO of the former of General Electric and all that. Yeah, and you know, and I said, HR manager. And because Jack Welsh was ruthless, you know, he'd churn through staff in terms of making sure they got rid of any deadwood and kept the cream. But you know, it's the analogy that when we looked at all these issues, the best analogy that my HR manager came up with was the analogy of a bus. And he said, as a bus is a business, you get the wrong people off the bus, get the right people onto the bus, and then you get the right people into the right seats. And you know, some people might have a weakness in certain areas, but you know, there is a spot for them in an organisation, and trying to be mindful of that is important. And as a business, I suppose one of the big mistakes we tend to do is underestimate the capability of my own staff. And you get external staff in, and you know, with sometimes an injection of new blood certainly doesn't hurt, but you know, it can be a bit of an issue, and it comes back to that sort of cultural issue that I think we talked about earlier. Was, you know, everyone's my winemakers say that we don't need to answer that, because you know, we don't need to ask that because they know how I think, for better or for worse. But you know, they know exactly when there's an issue, what I'd say, and very rarely the issue becomes brought to my attention. And I still have these discussions with the winemakers about certain things, and you know, it's you know, and the arguments, again, as I talked about earlier, that the friction can come from having a short-term focus as opposed to a long-term focus. And being a family business, it's always about having that longer-term focus. Yep. And you know, trying to deal with the short-term issues on the way through.
Yep. Now, given the industry that we're in, which is the financial services, professional services, we're going through, and I think there'd be a number of firms in here that go back a step to what you mentioned before with regards to acquisition. And I know there's accounting firms or financial planning firms that would, you know, the numbers stack up okay, so you move forward with the acquisition. I think one of the critical factors you just brought in was the cultural aspect and how they need to align, let's call it. What's a lesson or an experience maybe that you can share for all of our listeners here, that if they're going to go through that stage, and I suppose end of the day, I've always had this philosophy in my mind: you start a business to one day sell it. Now, in your case, yours is about generational, which is fantastic. But when you decide to buy or you decide to sell, what's a lesson that you can share, or you know, whether it be a positive or a negative, that you can share with our guests?
Oh, it's been such a long time. Like I said, the small version is what's happening in Europe. When we bought a company that sort of specialised in dealcoholizing wine, and because that's a growth market segment in the wine industry, as people sort of move away from alcohol, which I can't understand the move, but you know, that's I like a bit of alcohol in my red, particularly at night. It's the best sleeping pill that you can have. Yeah, but the culture there was run by an engineer. Classic example of engineers, and this comes back to an example of one of the local businesses. Well, it's an equally large business, and their focus is toward delivery. And my IT managers, his wife actually worked in the HR department, and uses an example of, the problem with most very good technical people, they tend to be on the spectrum, which, the Asperger's spectrum. And if you're a good engineer and if you're great with numbers and everything else, it's more than likely you're going to be on the spectrum. And so doing the job technically is very good at, but in terms of management, not so good at. And and we had to laugh because there was an example of one of their top engineers, and they lost one of the managers in the department, so they promoted this engineer to the management role, and they lamented the fact that they lost their best engineer and inherited and got their worst manager. So skill sets, and most great managers have great skill sets in terms of empathy with staff and being mindful of that. So it's just something, if you're involved very closely in technical aspects of the work, it's just something to be mindful of, that, more than likely you're on the spectrum, and I'm not innocent on that either, mate. But the most brilliant minds tend to be on the spectrum, and but it can create issues. Yeah,
exactly. I know my partner, she reminds me a bit of that all the time. She talks about me being on the spectrum.
About you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's quite light, but you laugh, but it's funny now. I think about, I look at people, I think, I now try to work out where they are on the spectrum, in terms of sort of dealing with them. But, thankfully, most of my staff, it's that culture then so overrides that. So, and as IT manager says, culture eats strategy for breakfast, eats strategy. So, and that's a really important thing too, culture is number one, it just dominates.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, fantastic little lesson there for everyone listening. Let's talk about the matriarch. Let's talk about Emery. Tell me about what makes this lady so special.
Well, for my mother, I suppose, it's an important role, and she's still very, sort of, as far as the family comes, it's family's number one for her. So it's all about, family cohesion and keeping the family happy, and looking after the, keeping all the individual family members. And I got to laugh because it's when she puts the foot down, everyone jumps, which is not often done, but it is done. So, for example, our gardener might have a problem with getting some fences, getting some gates built for the garden, whatever, and the maintenance guys will say, look, we're just busy at the moment, but you can't, get to it later, and they never get to it, and then my mother goes around, and next day, bang, it's been done. Yeah, so that's, but yeah, she's all about family. Family for her is number one, and it's important having that sort of matriarch, that role there.
Yeah, and I've got no doubt, the word respect would play a fairly big role in that as well.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Brilliant. So mate, tell me about the vision. You touched on an interesting point before with regards to wine without alcohol, and that is where the future is heading, which I must admit I've become a little bit more aware of that only recently, but I don't know how big it is. What's the vision?
Well, it's something that it's just catering to market demand, and I'm sorry, but I personally don't think I could drink wine that doesn't have alcohol in it. It goes against everything, I stand for, but it's an important part of the market, and it's growing, and it's going to, as people become more health conscious, but, become important. Well, people may just want to have a glass of wine, which for various reasons, they may be pregnant or whatever. They just don't want the risk of having it, or they might be religious, might be Muslim. They want to have alcohol. They want to have wine, but they don't want to, upset their faith. But certainly it's the number one driver at the moment. So the health concerns, and wine's got full of lots of goodies without the alcohol. Potassium, it's anthocyanins, tannins, which are all antioxidants, and you go through all the makeup of wine. It's really is as one as one friend years ago said to me, it really should be classified as a health drink. Yeah, so it's full of so much goodies, and the Romans treated it very much that way. And you know, I always laugh about the famous Roman Latin saying, you know, in vino veritas, in wine there is truth. You know, it's, you know, and then the culture of all that going back, you know, those ancient cultures, and
Correct.
you know, and some of them wouldn't make a decision until they were drunk. And then they revisit the decision when they were sober. But, you know, the whole argument is because people were able to speak their minds freely, you know, and that's what it was all about. And even the word symposium comes from the Greek, and that was all about having a few wines, get together and having a few wines. And that's the basis of the word symposium. You know, it had its basis in getting around and having a good time, you know, talking about weird and wonderful stuff.
Yeah, agree. And, you know, having done a little bit of business in that Singapore Chinese region as well, it's how the Chinese tend to operate. They tend to do things over alcohol, and they see how things pan out at the end of the night, and that's how the business is done.
Well, exactly. And it's all about seeing how you react and what you know, so it's, you know, it's not about, so it's very much part of that, you know, in vino veritas, you know, in wine is truth, and alcohol, you know, is truth. So, you know, and how you behave. So that's an important part to be aware of when you're dealing with these cultures. You know, you don't want to get too drunk and make a fool of yourself, which I've been known to do in the past when I was a lot younger.
I'm sure we all have. That's what the experience is all about, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's right. You learn from your mistakes.
Correct. We've got about 10 minutes left. If anyone's got any questions, please throw them into the Q&A as we continue, because I'm going to touch on a few things, and certainly I want to talk about passion for a second. And do you believe passion is something that you can be taught, or is it something you either have or you don't have?
Oh, I think it's part of the, you know, just part of your upbringing. You can be, you know, you can be passionate about something. You know, always the problem with passion, always have a, you know, concern that it also means lack of pragmatism. You know, the passion might override the pragmatism, so that would be the concern. But you know, in terms of passion, yeah, look, it's, you know, I live in a wonderful place, and the house has got lovely gardens and an ornamental dam which is full of native fish and nice clear water once we got rid of the carp. And then we've got a Rutherglen operation, and which is nice because it's only 3 hours drive away down heading towards Melbourne. And then on the way I go through, then past, and about an hour down the road, I go through our King Valley vineyard, and then on the outskirts of Melbourne, I end up with our Yarra Valley winery and vineyards. And so it's just a nice, that's a family company. You know, would I really want to wish for much more? Not really. I think it's, you know, I think the family's got it pretty, you know, it's got that sort of nice sort of critical mass without, which then provides a good lifestyle for the family members.
Yeah, brilliant. So let's talk about the future family members. There's a few coming through, and obviously, what's your legacy for the next generation? That'll be the fourth, yeah. Yeah,
it's the fourth generation, but you know, and the problem is because, you know, even though we're fourth generation, effectively third, because when my grandparents passed away, my father was left the wine business. The other aspects of the business, the distribution and warehousing, were given to his sisters at the time. So that sort of negated this sort of generational problem. So we're sort of in the fourth generation. I'm technically, in terms of the lifespan of family businesses, we're still the third generation. So the fourth generation, the next generation coming through, will be critical. And you know, I suppose that's, and it's not, you know, being part of the family business association. And you know, one of the big problems with family businesses, it's not the family members per se that is the problem. It's the in-laws, the outsiders that come into the business, and that's where a lot of friction can arise. And it's that seemed to be always a common theme when I used to sort of attend the family business conferences and that in, you know, sort of earlier years.
Yeah.
And, you know, and all that ties in with succession planning and business planning and all that as well. How do you handle that?
Yeah, very, very true. Succession planning, or I think I spoke to a couple of firms the other day and they were talking about again, just from an employee point of view, an employee share option plan. So how do you get that buy-in from the externals, let's call it? So just as important.
Yeah, but it's quite interesting. It does, being a family business, you don't want to hand over control, and in a few areas where we have with other business, that has created problems. Because the problem is it doesn't fit with the long-term perspective. If there's problems, who wears it? It's the family that wear it. It's not, so that the risk-reward equation's probably not quite that strong as it should be. If you're gonna, I like the idea of people sort of having skin in the game, so to speak. But you've got to be careful, and culture for me is probably the single most important thing. And it probably, if they're comfortable working with the family, comfortable with their role in the business, everything else is, I find, is pretty sweet.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Now, with what have we got? 8 minutes left. So again, if you've got any questions, throw them in there. We're going to look to wrap up with a couple of key questions around growth and success. What are your top 3 things you'd like to share, or what do you think you can focus on for future growth and success? You mentioned culture before, which is obviously number 1 on your list.
Well, the culture is exceptionally important. Having a robust balance sheet is also very important. Yeah. So and our strategy of being sort of fairly conservative has actually worked exceptionally well. It's and result in a fairly strong balance sheet. One of the things is, a classic example is we own all our warehouses. Now, there could be a strong argument that you shouldn't buy the warehouses, you should sell them off and you just rent and all that. But, in the wine industry, it really is an agricultural industry, which tends to be capital intensive by its very nature, as farming business are. So they all tend to be asset rich, but cash flow poor. And so those decisions, which, at the time, we always bought warehouses. We had built warehouses when things weren't, when we couldn't find anything that was suitable. And, that's been very important, because it's what's happened. Real estate values have gone through the roof with the low interest rate environment. And, and that's certainly helped our gearing level dramatically in terms of the current state of the wine industry, which has, kept the banks relatively happy so far.
So true. So true. Well done. So anything more you want to add in terms of, to our listeners, a focus on future growth and success?
Well, personnel is number 1 as well, culture, which then people tie into that as well. But having good people, it's, and it seems, I watch Bloomberg occasionally, and I forget who the gentleman is, but he's always going on, having the right people, and it's number 1.
Yep. So from a people perspective, what do you think is the key to then growing a great team?
I just think communication, being mindful of everyone's contribution, thinking outside the box is big. And it's the issues with staff in the past is usually comes back to the inability to think outside the box. Really has been a big problem. In the past, most of my staff are able to think well and truly think outside the box. De Bortoli, for example, where in terms of the environment, or where the very first platinum sustainable business in New South Wales. So out of all the businesses, we were the first platinum holder. And, that all comes back to those sort of thinking outside the box. We have problems, clearly define the problems, get good advice, and for example, just a simple issue, we had problems with the cleaning agent, which was sodium hydroxide. Now, sodium hydroxide in your effluent stream, because it's used to clean tanks and the same stuff you use basically in washing machines. The problem is sodium builds up. So if you can't get rid of the discharge to the sewage system, you're not close to the thing. So you've got to utilize it. So we made the decision to move to potassium hydroxide as a cleaning agent, where because plants could utilize the potassium, so it was fully sustainable. And that's all that sort of just simple stuff. So now we grow a crop out of our wastewater, which does return it, which gives a great return, self-funding. At the moment, it's just little, lots of little things that got us over the line. But that was just a classic thinking outside the box. It's just, and it comes back to us talking to you earlier on before we had this hookup. Clearly defining the problem. That's number one. It's amazing how many business don't, and we're honest, and we're guilty of that as well, in terms of not clearly defining what the problem is. Yep. And and that's sort of, you see that government policy, and lots of times they don't clearly define the problem, and the solutions just become a bloody disaster.
Yes. Very true. Very true. So there's a great little lesson for everybody that's listening, in terms of whether it's getting team members to give you feedback, whether it's customer feedback. And going back to the old days of getting customer feedback as well, because your best customers will probably tell you sometimes, the things you're doing well and the things you're not doing well. So you can bring that.
Well, it's a very good point you raise. Or even your competitors usually know where you're making mistakes, more so than your own organisation, which I just find fascinating. Outsiders can know where you're making mistakes or know where your issues are. But you're right about customers' feedback. They have a bit of grasp on what's happening than you do sometimes.
Yeah, and it builds loyalty as well, because they feel like they're being heard. You're acting on that. Same as team members. When they feel they're being heard, that improves communication all round. It improves culture, because they feel like they can be open and honest, as opposed to sometimes people can be open and honest and they get shot down. Well, that's not going to build great culture. That's going to build poor culture. Yeah,
well, exactly. No one's going to have an input, and some of the silly suggestions sometimes have merit.
Correct.
Yeah,
brilliant. Well, mate, it looks like we don't have any questions, which is probably not a bad thing either, just checking that out. So if you've got anything you want to ask Darren, we've got about 1 minute before we wrap up. Otherwise, mate, thank you very much. Thanks for you being open and honest, your thoughts, your comments, your advice. A special shout out to Lee Noble. Lee, actually, we met last October on the Gold Coast, and she was the one that put me in touch with you, Darren. So we certainly thank you very much, and to the De Bortoli family as well. So I apologise for getting that wrong earlier.
Yeah, De Bortoli. And thanks, Lee, and thanks, Paul.
Beautiful. All of you guys that have joined us, a massive thank you. It's been fantastic again to open up this masterclass series with a wonderful guest to share some fantastic things about, obviously, the family, how that survived the test of 95 years, and how that is going to be continued to be grown through the next generation. So please look out for my next masterclass show. It is on the 9th of March. It's coming up in a few weeks' time, and I'm chatting to the new CEO of Class. So I know they're doing some fantastic things. They're a part of the Hub 24 group, and Tim Steele will be joining me here. So if you haven't met Tim before, who again he's very customer-centric focused. So it'd be interesting to chat to him. I've worked with him 25 years ago, and he's a very, very, very clever man. So Darren, thanks for joining us today. To all of you, thanks. Until I see you next time, signing off. Talk to you soon.